Welcome to Decouple China Radio Daily News Recap for June 30th, 2021, a production of Decouple China PAC. I'm your host, Paul Boardman. You can find Decouple China PAC, including daily news updates from around the world, at decoupledchina.org. Now, some June 30th Decouple China news. Bloomberg. After losing China, Uber's stake in DiDi reaps $8 billion in IPO. Business Insider. China's crackdown on crypto has led to a 23% decline in ether mining over the last month. NEWSWEEK. Trump turns attention on China for fentanyl coming into U.S. during visit to Texas border. REUTERS. China manufacturing slows as supply shortages roil Asia industry. Bloomberg. Negative views of China persist despite COVID gains, Pew finds. Majorities in 15 of the 17 advanced economies surveyed this year by the Pew Research Center hold an unfavorable opinion of China, including record highs in Canada, Germany, South Korea, and the U.S. Some 76% of Americans said they viewed the world's most populous nation unfavorably in February, up 3 percentage points from last year. NEWSWEEK opinion. A century of misery for the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP will say or do anything to expand its power. Nothing is off limits and nothing is sacred. This has been clear from the very beginning, and yet all these years later, the world struggles to grasp its implications. Once the CCP successfully took charge, it attacked virtually anyone with ties to the former nationalist government. At least 5 million civilians met an early grave during the CCP's first tyrannical decade. As bleak as the first few years were, the worst was yet to come. In 1958, CCP Chairman Mao Zedong initiated the Great Leap Forward, a harebrained plan to rapidly industrialize the Chinese economy. He herded hundreds of millions of laborers into work communes and seized control of every lever of the economy. Everything was collectivized and food was rationed. The result was the worst famine in history. As one historian put it, China descended into hell. At least 45 million people died, with starvation so widespread that many resorted to cannibalism. The CCP knew exactly what was happening. Mao rebuffed reports of famine, purged officials who raised concerns, and ordered those who remained to double down. In any given year of the famine, the CCP incarcerated at least 8 to 9 million people in gulags where forced labor, torture, and political indoctrination were the norm. At least 3 million died of starvation and disease in these barbaric houses of horror. The CCP has conspired for decades to transform and destroy local identities in Tibet and now Xinjiang. These campaigns of cultural erasure have slowly stripped Tibetans, Uyghurs, and other ethnic groups of their culture, language, faith, and way of life. The ongoing mass internment and genocide in Xinjiang today is the latest and most egregious manifestation of this campaign. After the famine ended in 1962, Mao managed to retain power for more than a decade by waging his infamous Cultural Revolution. The result was an indiscriminate war on all things traditional, targeting intellectuals, businessmen, religious leaders, and others. The campaign created mass hysteria and unthinkable violence with constant struggle sessions against those suspected of disloyalty to the CCP. Mobs of radicals would drag innocents into the public square, accuse them of political crimes, and beat them, often to death. Victims were forced to stand in the burning sun or sometimes kneel on broken glass. People were mutilated, branded with hot irons, doused in gasoline. The mobs forced husband to turn against wife, brother against sister, and parent against child. 2 million were killed as the Cultural Revolution tore apart the fabric of Chinese society. Of course, some insist that the CCP should be judged primarily on its more recent history, not the murderous record of its first 3 decades in power. They will point to China's subsequent economic growth and absolve the CCP for Mao's crimes that left the country in ruins. After Mao's death, in a desperate attempt to retain power, the CCP allowed limited reforms. But while those economic reforms provided breathing room for the regime and some space for the industrious Chinese people to create the wealth we see today, the political brutality continued. Corrupt CCP members lived like parasites off the hard labor of a subjugated people. The Chinese people continue to live under the threat of political violence and suffer systemic human rights abuses, epitomized by the CCP's massacre of hundreds, likely thousands, of peaceful protesters in Tiananmen Square in June 1989. Furthermore, the CCP's so-called reform era brought us the greatest attack on the sanctity of the family, the most important institution in traditional Confucian society. In all of history, the one-child policy, which resulted in an estimated 400 million state-mandated abortions and sterilizations, these same evils are now being utilized to commit genocide against Uyghurs and other Muslims, more than 1 million of whom suffer today in Xi Jinping's labor and detention camps. The CCP's so-called reform area has most recently brought us the effective destruction of a free Hong Kong. Across the entire country, the CCP has closed thousands of Christian churches, banned the Falun Gong outright, and imprisoned or disappeared hundreds of lawyers who defend the CCP's victims in court. Outside its borders, the CCP is working to tirelessly destroy the democratic international order, bully Taiwan, and terrorize neighboring states through ludicrous territorial claims. The CCP's reform area amounted to nothing by the measure that matters most, creating lives of purpose protected by freedom and fundamental rights. Even the economic gains are starting to slip away thanks to the CCP's mismanagement. Why? Because this is the Chinese Communist Party. This is who it has been for 100 years, and it is who it will be for the next 100 if we fail to stand up to its tyranny. But if we rise to the occasion, the Chinese Communist Party will surely meet its just end in time, and July 1 will then be observed as a day of mourning in a free democratic China. Until that day arrives, let us take a moment to reflect on and pray for the brave Chinese as well as Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongolians who have suffered under the CCP. Let us look to the examples set by those who have dared to resist the CCP and resolve to stand with them. The world is waking up to their suffering and will no longer stay silent. No longer will we sit passively as aiders and abettors in the West. Nationless corporations, Hollywood, big tech, and Wall Street help bankroll the CCP's oppression and censor the stories of these freedom fighters. Instead, we resolve to fight side by side with them until the day that this evil regime fails and the people whom the CCP have subjugated can finally live freely without fear. Reuters. Taiwan tells U.S. it hopes to sign free trade deal. Washington Examiner. Japanese official warns U.S. of potential surprise attack on Hawaii from Russia and China. Wall Street Journal. Is China's Communist Party still communist? Fox News. Chinese whistleblower exposes COVID-19's origins on Tucker Carlson. Yan determined, in her opinion, that COVID-19 was a biologically engineered weapon that got out of control, designed by the Chinese military after they learned of its effectiveness during the first SARS outbreak. The Washington Post. China building more than 100 missile silos, expanding nuclear capabilities. BBC. China pressure undermining Australian universities, report says. Human Rights Watch found students feel surveilled in Australia, leading many to self-censor in classrooms. The Guardian. U.S. image rebounds while unfavorable views of China remain. Global survey finds China scored higher than the U.S. when it came to handling the pandemic in survey of global attitudes. Half or more people in almost every place surveyed, it is more important for their nation to have strong economic ties with the U.S. than with China. The views were different in Singapore, 33%, and New Zealand, 45%. Reuters. Ratings for China's Xi stuck near lows while U.S. rebounds, survey says. CBS News. 1 year firmly under China's thumb, Hong Kong has become more dangerous than Beijing. NPR. China's tough Hong Kong law turns 1 year old, and it's already grown teeth. CBS News. China expert John Culver on Beijing's military prowess. Intelligence matters. Wall Street Journal. China's economy flashes hints of weakness. Expansion in the factory sector slowed in June, while the services sector softened as COVID-19 outbreaks dampened consumer sentiment. The Guardian. Global chip shortage hits car production in China and Japan. Semiconductor problem hits wider industry with growth in China at 4-month low and 6% drop in Japan. Financial Times. U.S. and Japan conduct war games amid rising China-Taiwan tensions. Space News. China outlines space plans to 2025. Lunar, interplanetary, and near-Earth asteroid missions, space station construction, a national satellite internet project, and developing heavy-lift launch vehicles and reusable space transportation systems are noted as major projects for the period 2021 through 2025. South China Morning Post. China's U.S. trade deal commitments more than 30% short of year-to-date target. Reuters. Chinese EV maker Xpeng to raise $1.8 billion in Hong Kong listing. The Block. Beijing and Suzhou enable China's digital yuan payments for subways. Wall Street Journal. U.S.-Taiwan revive trade talks with pledge to combat forced labor. China has condemned the talks, objecting to official interactions between the U.S. and Taiwan. Data center dynamics. TSMC acquires another 90 hectares in Taiwan for 2 nanometer chip fabrication, but don't expect it to come in time to fix this chip crisis. Reuters. Taiwan tells U.S. it hopes to sign free trade deal. Taiwan News. Finland backs Taiwan's international participation in latest China report. Finland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs released an updated version of its white paper on China titled Governmental Action Plan on China, emphasizing support for Taiwan's international participation for the first time. The Diplomat. U.S. clears F-16 sale to Philippines as South China Sea tensions brew. Whether Manila can afford them is another question. Forbes. Will the Philippines buy F-16 jets to patrol South China Sea? Reuters. China's Xi pledges reunification with Taiwan, gets stern rebuke. CNBC. Ex-diplomat says Xi Jinping has pushed the envelope, but Chinese Communist Party still insecure. Bloomberg. A $30 billion fund piles into Hong Kong's office market. The Conversation. China's one-child policy left at least 1 million bereaved parents childless and alone in old age with no one to care for them. BBC News. Theatrics or threat? How to handle China at 100. AFP. Xi hails irreversible rise of China at 100th birthday of Communist Party. CNBC. Taiwan is the most dangerous flashpoint in U.S.-China relations, says former Singapore diplomat. Fox News. China, Russia, exploiting United Nations to push back against U.S. interest, report says. Thank you for listening to Decouple China Radio's daily China news recap from around the world with your host, Paul Boardman. A list of these publications and broadcasts can be found at decoupledchina.org.